Hello, I'm Julian Bagini. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's event hosted by the RSA. I'm delighted to be joined by Rob Percival. Rob is the head of food policy at the Soil Association and a campaigner and writer. His expertise in food policy and food sustainability has informed his fascinating new book, The Meat Paradox: Eating, Empathy, and the Future of Meat, which has been widely praised both for its intellectual nuance and its powerful challenge. In the book, Rob explores humanity's relationship with meat from the dawn of Homo sapiens to the present day, arguing that it has always been emotionally and ethically complicated. Rob, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get started, I just want to welcome everyone to join in the conversation today in the live chat by using the hashtag RSA Eating Meat. We'd love to hear your thoughts and comments. So, Rob, let's just start off by getting a handle on the key concept behind this book. So what is the meat paradox, and when did you first come across it?
So this is a term borrowed from social psychology, from a body of research that's emerged just in the last decade. And broadly speaking, it relates to the contradictions in our relationship with the animals that we consume. We often seem to say one thing and do another. Many of us say that we care about animal welfare, but it's intensively farmed, low welfare animals which make up the bulk of our diet in the UK, particularly chickens and pigs. 1 in 3 of us claims to be eating less meat. We're going flexitarian or veggie or vegan, but actually the data shows no meaningful decline in overall consumption. So there's some sort of split going on. And psychologists are beginning to understand that this is shaped in part by a set of psychological pressures, cognitive pressures derived from our empathy. We care about animals, we don't want to see them harmed. And when we recognize that they are harmed for our consumption, we feel this sense of dissonance, and this generates all sorts of fascinating and unexpected consequences. And the book traces some of those consequences through our culture and through other cultures. And as you say, back into human history.
Well, we perhaps would say a little bit more coming up in minutes about how deep this sort of goes. But I mean, it is very evident that I think it's pretty incontroversial that there are, at the very least, tensions in people's attitudes towards meat. I always think it's quite evident in pet food, actually, in the sense that people are feeding their pets animals which are often raised in pretty horrific conditions. So I mean, so this is around. People have this. There are ways people deal with it, rationalize it every day, some of which are pretty weak. So what are the kind of strategies that people have for managing this tension?
Well, first of all, we as a society tell a story about our relationship with the animals around us, and we at the center of that is this process of categorization. Some animals are food animals, some are wild animals, and our relationship is shaped in a profound way by that categorization. We tend to think of food animals as having lower capacities for sentience and intelligence. They're less morally valuable. This is what psychologists have been discovering. This is all going on beneath the surface of thought. We don't necessarily realize that this is how we look at these animals. And we like to, or we find ways of detaching from their death. We're not involved in, many of us, in the process of their sort of production, and we're certainly not involved in their slaughter. And we build on that physical dissociation with subtle forms of cognitive dissociation. So we find ways of talking and thinking about animals, which means that we don't really recognize when we're faced with a plate full of meat that there has been an animal behind it, that there has been a death involved. And we find through this mixture of sort of denial and evasion and narrative and rite and ritual, a route through these tensions, which means that for the most part, they don't really bother us, but they can be profoundly disturbing when we're confronted with the reality of what's involved in meat production.
Yeah, and of course, in sort of modern industrialized society, that kind of distancing is easier because most people aren't actually close to the animals that they eat. But of course, for most of human history, people were closer. And you talk about the various ways in which cultures have sort of come up with sort of narratives that help them to manage this, in particular narratives of consent and of contract. Could you say a little bit about those and how widespread are they?
So the book explores how these tensions are handled in very different cultures, indigenous hunting cultures. And what anthropologists have found is that despite the dazzling sort of diversity displayed across these cultures, there are recurring characteristics in terms of how they relate to animals. It's typically required that the hunter will have to ask for permission from some sort of spiritual guardian before hunting an animal. It's often said that the animal itself, the individual animal, will have to give its consent to be killed. And through a process of ritual treatment of the body, it's believed that the animal's soul will be reborn in another body. And these all point towards a sense of sort of moral and metaphysical anxiety associated with killing. And the complex rites and rituals which you find associated with meat in every culture, meat is typically the most tabooed food, are ways of managing this really difficult fact that eating involves killing. And this idea of consent recurs throughout these narratives across different indigenous hunting cultures and in our own culture to a certain degree. We talk of this sort of contractual relationship with domesticated animals. We say that they give us their bodies, and in return we give them a good life. We look after them and so on. And there's this sort of implicit understanding that there's consent involved, even if there is no literal consent that's even possible.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, you talk a lot about our sort of history, going way back to the dawn of Homo sapiens, as I said in the introduction. And you kind of push this argument quite strongly that actually a great deal of human culture is pretty much explained by this need to deal with what you call this sort of ethical anxiety. And you even think that applies to cave art. You're suggesting that cave painting is driven partly by this meat paradox. How is that so?
So when you look back in the archaeological record for the earliest evidence that our relationship with animals had become complicated in some sense, ethically or culturally complicated, the earliest material evidence arises around 40,000 years ago, where our ancestors began painting in caves, crafting their images, making art of various forms. And we really don't know what these images were about, but we know that they were primarily motivated by animals. For 30,000 years, they crawled into dark recesses and painted upon the walls. And it was repeatedly and overwhelmingly animal images that they painted. And we don't know what they're about necessarily, but when you look at contemporary cultures, and these people who were painting in these caves were as contemporary as us. They were fully modern. They were physiologically, anatomically, cognitively modern. When you look at contemporary cultures where people live in close proximity to animals, are involved in hunting them and killing them, we find this substrate of moral anxiety, which exercises a profound influence over their culture. It's a really formative influence. Some of the most important narratives, rituals, social behaviors are all oriented around maintaining the right relationship with the animal world in a context where you are killing and consuming those animals. So it's partly speculative, but it seems to me entirely reasonable to think that this formative influence stretches back thousands of years. And there are several cave art scholars who have voiced similar ideas, who find that in these caves evidence of a process of ritual restitution in relation to the animals that are killed and consumed.
So this tension exists in some form. I think that's pretty undeniable. So there's a tension between, on the one hand, we say we love animals, on the other hand, we kill and eat them. It seems like there are two obvious ways we could potentially seek to eliminate this tension. So let's start with the first obvious one: don't eat meat, right? So if we don't eat meat, we don't have to suffer this tension because we love animals and we don't eat them. End of story. So, but your book isn't a vegan polemic. So why do you think that way out, that simple way out, isn't perhaps as fruitful as it may first appear, perhaps?
Well, I explore the role that meat eating has played throughout our evolution, and in relation to sort of diverse societies embedded in different ecosystems, and it's typically been the case throughout human evolution and throughout human history that we've needed to balance the needs of our biology against the possibilities of our environment, and that's always meant eating animals. There's been a degree of necessity involved in our animal consumption, And I don't think that we've transcended that today. I think that as individuals in modern Western society, it's quite easy to be vegan or to adopt a wholly plant-based diet. If you walk into a supermarket, you don't need to pick up the pork sausages. You can pick up the plant-based sausages. But when you look at how to build a sustainable farming system, nourish a population wherein lots of people are suffering from food insecurity, respond to the climate and nature crises, it becomes a lot more complicated. And there's actually, I think, a really important role for animals in our farming system, in our diets in some contexts, so that there is, I think, a persistent necessity. But that necessity, I don't think, provides ethical closure. I don't think it means that it's therefore okay that we kill animals and consume them. And I think that we need to have a much more honest process of negotiation as to what the most ethical food system looks like. In these indigenous cultures that I discussed, there's this recurring ethic that turns up again and again, which says that you should kill only what you need, which seems to me to be a perfectly reasonable principle in which to base a sort of set of ethics around animal consumption. And we're nowhere near that in our society. We're really not limiting consumption to that which is necessary. We're not even having an honest conversation about what that might look like. So the book hopes to open this up a bit and prompt that sort of conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because a lot of vegans today would perhaps acknowledge the fact that historically meat eating has been a necessity, but it's very common for people to say it just no longer is, and they'd point to issues around nutrition. But there are, as you say, there are issues around farming. Why is actually animal agriculture important to sustainable farming?
Well, I'd say that animal agriculture is, as it's typically embodied in the world, is a huge problem. These industrialized systems of meat production and dairy production are hugely damaging in an environmental sense, and they typically entail low levels of welfare and issues for human well-being as well. But in the sort of more sustainable farming systems, where you're minimizing agrochemical inputs, you're easing reliance on fossil fuels, you're nurturing soil health and biodiversity across the farm, animals, particularly grazing animals, can play a really important role in helping to cycle nutrients, bring the soil back to life, shape the landscape, and they can, in a nutritional sense, turn sort of marginal lands into nutrient-dense foods. So there is, I think, a really important role there. That doesn't mean we all have to eat meat, and actually I think a large proportion of the population could and perhaps should be wholly plant-based or far more plant-based. But it's clear that there's no easy solution to any of this. So when you hear people saying that we just remove all animals from the picture and then you have a sustainable farming system, I think that's highly dubious.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. One of the, I think, strengths of your book is there's a lot of really sort of good hard information there, and it really points the ways in which there's some simplistic arguments, because not all agriculture is the same. But it is true that the majority of agriculture is of a fairly scary kind. One of the stats that stuck out for me was that, well, a couple here. In the past half century, the global population of farm animals has tripled, right? Tripled in 50 years, while the populations of wild animals have declined by 2/3. And that globally, roughly 40% of all arable land is used to grow feed crops, such as soy and maize, mostly for animals housed in indoor systems. And in the UK, roughly 50% of arable land is used for this purpose. So it is a pretty grim picture of where we've gone. But going back a bit to this issue of this balance between necessity, I think this is really very interesting, because you're saying that you acknowledge there is and has been a kind of necessity to eating meat and animal products, but that doesn't close the moral argument. And I think a lot of people would assume that, if you have to do something, it's morally okay. I mean, that is the justification. So I'd just like to hear a little bit more about why you think it doesn't close down the ethics. Why isn't it at the end of the story to say it's got to be done, therefore it's morally okay? Particularly if you think of populations such as Inuit, who absolutely depended on animal foods and couldn't have survived without it. It would seem odd to some people to think that there's any moral issue left over once we've established that, yeah, they've got to do it.
Right, and I think that there's an important distinction to be drawn between the sort of construction of a moral justification in the abstract and our embodied experience, our ethical experience. I think if you want a rational stance on whether as an Inuit hunter you're justified in eating this deer, then it's quite easy to reach that conclusion. Yes, of course you are. It's necessary. That's what's available in this environment, which is your home. But the act of killing that deer might still be profoundly distressing when you begin to empathize with the animal that you're engaged with, either actively, perhaps you've been stalking the animal through the forest, and this is a recurring theme in the literature, in order to, as an indigenous hunter in various of these environments, in order to find, lure and locate the animal and then kill them, you have to empathize with them. But that brings a degree of moral anxiety and ethical distress upon the moment of their death. And even in these societies where you have a narrative that reassures you that the animal will be reborn, even where there is this narrative of consent and permission that has been granted, we still find an expression in the testimony of these hunters that it's a profoundly distressing act. It can feel like murder. And this word recurs throughout the literature for over the past 100 years. Many of the rites and rituals that surround meat in these traditional societies are there to differentiate that act of killing from wanton murder. So there's and the book explores some of the roots of this, looking at convergent evidence from cognitive neuroscience and evolutionary biology and infant development, exploring why in this embodied encounter there can be this ethical dimension, which is difficult to argue away or reason away in the abstract.
Yeah, I can see that. I suppose the question I've got is how possible it is to come to some kind of, a relationship with the animal in which you don't have anxiety. You may have other emotions. Because thinking again, how would you eliminate this paradox? Well, I've suggested on one side it's to not eat animals. On the other side, it's to kind of come to a different understanding of what it means to love and respect animals, and an understanding on which that is not incompatible with the killing and eating of them. And I suppose before reading your book, I was kind of persuaded that there are people who have a deep sensitivity to the natural world and to animals, and they develop a kind of a different relationship, which is not sentimental, but nor is it a detached one, nor is one of turning off their emotions, where they don't seem to have this kind of dissonance or anxiety. There may be a slight element of discomfort to a certain degree, but it's quite managed. And if I think about, you work for the Soil Association, so you know many people who work with animals, farm with animals. Helen Browning, your CEO, Patrick Holden, who used to be part of the Soil Association. There are these people who you met who work with animals. They love the animals. Do you really think all of them are experiencing a deep moral anxiety about it?
No, I don't. And I think that you're quite right that there are different ways that we can handle this fundamental tension, different ways that we can position ourselves in relation to the potential to feel those that moral anxiety and those conflicted emotions. And I think there are among us, they're in a minority in terms of the whole population, those who have thought deeply about this and engaged closely with animals and with the issue, and have reached some sort of state of resolve in relation to the killing and consumption of these animals. But I think two thoughts. One is that even in that situation, there are often beneath the surface coping mechanisms of which we're partly oblivious. So if you eat cows but not cats, if you invite one into your home and not the other, if you regularly consume the meat of animals that someone else has killed, then you're leaning on these sort of socially entrenched coping mechanisms. This process of categorization is profoundly powerful, and if one was suddenly dished up with a horse or a dog, then there would be a very different experience of eating. So I think that there are often, even among those who have reached a state of resolve, subtle forms of denial, which is still at play. And I think that we should become conscious, at least, of what those coping mechanisms or modes of denial are. But I'm interested in the subtext of your question as well, which is that it's better not to feel moral anxiety in relation to killing. And clearly there's a sort of naive form of confusion and sentimentality across society in relation to meat, which it's good to move beyond and transcend. But the Tucano, this culture that I discussed at length in the book, struck me as really interesting, partly because this sense of moral anxiety is deliberately cultivated. It's a good thing to feel the full weight of moral and metaphysical responsibility when you're out hunting for a deer in the forest. It's good that that weighs heavily upon you. And as a child, if you sit down and to eat the meat, it's good that you're told a story wherein you're it's explained to you that overconsumption, unnecessary consumption, or sort of mindless consumption comes at a really high cost. These sort of tales of, as they exist in these societies, of repercussions. So I'd suggest that there's actually a form of sort of enlightened anxiety beyond that resolve, wherein we live in the conflict a bit more fully and honestly, and recognize the degree to which we do lean on these coping mechanisms, and let that sort of sense of conflict reshape our thought and perception in ways which allow us to see more clearly.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense to me, and I think I certainly wouldn't want to suggest that the ideal state would be one where no one has any sort of discomfort at all about the idea. And but I think that's not what you see when people who I spoke to the name escapes me now, the woman who very famously wrote a sort of best-selling book about raising her sheep and everything, Rosalind or something, and she loves her lambs, but still, it's always a moment of sadness and a distress when they have to go to slaughter. She doesn't like it. They never like it. And I think that you do hear that time and again from farmers. So reaching that state of, as it were, being completely unperturbed is a kind of form of inhumanity, if you like. But I also wonder whether or not there's a sweet spot here, in the sense that you talk about the sort of denial, and a lot of your book focus on the denial on the side of people who refuse to acknowledge the gravity of what they're doing when they kill another creature to eat it. I'm just wondering whether you think there's another kind of denial, which is the denial of the necessity of death and killing in the cycle of life, in the web of life. That the natural world, it depends upon predators and prey. Now, this can be used in a glib way just to justify any kind of animal exploitation, and that, of course, would be wrong. But do you think perhaps the most enlightened people also, they're not denying that either? They're fully looking in the eye, as it were, the necessity of the web of life to involve some animals killing other animals?
Perhaps. I mean, as you say, there are glib forms of this where we point to the natural world and say, look, killing is natural and normal, and therefore humans are predators, and let's just get on with it. And there are ways of positioning that argument which prop up industrialized animal agriculture, or at least distract us from this ethical imperative, which I keep coming back to limit our killing to that which is actually necessary. But certainly I think that there are, on the flip side, on the other side, among certain parts of the vegan movement, there is a sense in which this ethical commitment has become so powerful that it's begun to reshape the narrative of sort of human identity, to the degree that humans are portrayed as natural herbivores, and from a deep evolutionary line wherein animal consumption played a marginal role. So we try and sort of reshape the story of who we are to write this killing and our entanglement in a sort of omnivorous niche out of our stories. So I think I don't know if it's about degrees of enlightenment, but I think there's a real tension there, which neither side of the dietary debate likes to face up to.
Yeah, I think that's other reviewers have said the same. I think one of the great strengths of your book is that it doesn't sort of fall for these polarized simplicities, or defending the status quo, or completely denying any kind of claims of meat eating. Of course, one of the striking things about the book is that you do use the word murder for the killing and eating of animals, and there's a whole chapter on it. Now, at one point you do say, "I have no idea whether meat is murder" is true as a blanket statement, and I suspect it's probably not. But in the other mentions of the word murder, you sort of, certainly speaking from the way you see it, you do feel you need to call it what it is, and for you, that is what it is. It is murder. So why did you choose such a strong word, and why are you so convinced that is the right word?
So yeah, when we speak of animals, we use an extraordinary range of euphemisms or phrases for their killing. They're not only killed, they're slaughtered, gassed, processed, exterminated, euthanized, put down, butchered, culled, destroyed. And these words aren't so controversial, but murder seems to cross some sort of line. And I think there are two reasons for that. One is that there's a very clear legal definition of the term, wherein it's something that one human does to another. So in applying that word in the context of an animal's death, you're transgressing some sort of presumed species boundary in a way that implies severe sort of or far-reaching moral and perhaps even legal ramifications. But also because it's, I think it's controversial because it brings the individuality of the victim into view. It brings into view that there is a victim. This is what murder is, the premeditated act of violence inflicted by one person upon another, wherein the other is robbed of their life. And this is it's in a highly emotionally charged word, and I felt that it was appropriate as a description of what I witnessed in the slaughterhouse when I was in proximity to one cow in particular, where it was undoubtedly an act of violence, and I had the vivid perception in that moment of the cow's personhood, as different as that was to sort of, this was a cow person, it wasn't a human person, but there was a sort of vivid engagement on with that perception, and the as in the context of this discussion of indigenous cultures, where there is this repeating perception that meat might involve murder, even when it's justified. It's shorthand essentially for this sense of being gripped by the sense that you're taking the life of a morally important person, an animal person who has not consented to it, in which context the word would feel suitable. But it's controversial because it's associated with animal rights and people painting on butcher shop windows and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in terms of like, what the upshot is, what we should practically do. I mean, actually, one question I could ask here is that, I mean, I think we do live at a time in where people often do respond to the moral issues of the day in a sort of highly individualized way. It's what can I do? And the solution to everything is to be an ethical consumer. And if I make the right choices, that's the right thing. Against that, there's kind of an argument that actually, when you look at what's wrong with the food system, it is systemic. It requires societal change. These things are not mutually exclusive, of course, but if we're going to sort of fix the food system and make our relationship with animals more both sustainable and more ethical, would you want people to be pushing more at their own sort of personal choices, or do you think there's a necessity to push for broader societal and political changes?
All of the above, yeah. I mean, we're talking about completely reorienting our food system. We need to do this in the next 10 years in the face of the climate and nature crises, and in light of the sort of ethical consequences of the way that we eat. So it's a huge change, and it begins with a shift in government policy. We need changes in business practices, but the choices that we make as individuals are important, especially in relation to meat consumption, where it's high demand for intensively farmed poultry and pig, which is propping up these systems that we have here in the UK. So we absolutely need to change the way that we eat, and I think as part of that, there is a shift in power that's needed across the food system. A lot of the power sits in a small number of hands. These big corporations who are behind the sort of industrial production of meat and dairy, and a reallocation of power down to the producers, farmers, and communities is a key part of this as well.
I mean, I'm interested because one of the things you point to, and perhaps you can tell me the up-to-date data on this, is that you say there's evidence that in recent years there's been lots of headlines and talks about the rise of veganism, and lots of like striking headline figures. Often these figures are not so striking if you dig beneath the headlines. I mean, for example, a tripling of a very small number is still a very, very small number. But I think you say that actually the meat eating has actually increased, even as veganism has increased. Um, is that true, and how do you explain that?
Yeah, so discerning the full picture is difficult because there's no sort of unified data source around meat consumption. You can measure it in different ways based on people's food diaries or purchases and so on. But certainly what you see across the period from 2013 to 2020, when vegan diets were booming, flexitarianism was all the rage, 1 in 3 of us said we were cutting back on meat, there was no discernible decline in meat consumption across that period, according to food availability data from the AHDB. And dig beneath that, and I think the picture becomes quite interesting, because clearly some of us are eating less meat, but some of us are claiming to eat much less than we are, and some of us seem to be eating more. And actually there's research into the meat paradox in social psychology, which reveals some of the mechanisms which might be shaping this. It seems that there's a gender divide. Women are more inclined to underreport their consumption, and they're much more inclined to go vegetarian or vegan. Something like 80% of participants in Veganuary are women. And men are much more likely to dig their heels in and offer sort of justifications for their actions, and also potentially to increase their consumption. So there's probably been, as we've seen in the press, this process of polarization. The meat debates become very divided, and at one end of the spectrum there are folks who are eating more, and at the other end there are people who claim to be cutting back, I think, a lot more than they actually are.
I mean, in terms of bringing around change, I mean, awareness of issues in the food system have been there for a long time now. So you work for the Soil Association, which has been campaigning for this, and in most years the Soil Association is able to proudly boast some increases in the consumption of organic food in the country, with a few blips around recessions and things. But it's still, I mean, the statistics in your book make it very, very plain that it's still the case that the vast majority of the food being produced is being produced in environmentally unsustainable ways, and the vast majority of meat and dairy which is being produced in ways which I don't think it's. I think most people would find unpleasant and objectionable if they look them in the eye. I mean, do you think it's the old ways of campaigning have proven themselves to be ineffective? Do we need to be doing something different about this?
Oh, that's a big question. I mean, certainly, yes, the old ways of campaigning haven't got us to where we need to be, and I think that a lot of there's a big link between the fossil fuel agenda actually and the industrial animal farming agenda. It's not an obvious link in many people's eyes, but these systems of sort of mass meat and dairy production are only possible because of fossil fuel based fertilizers and the production of these cheap commodity crops as feedstock. And we're already seeing in the context of the Ukraine crisis and a pre-existing gas price challenge that fertilizers are becoming more difficult to access for farmers. Grain prices are escalating, and some of these systems of intensive meat production, which have been highly profitable for many years, are starting to look a bit shaky. Or at least it's becoming increasingly obvious that they're not going to be viable in the long run. So I think drawing in terms of the sort of new frontier of campaigning, teasing out the role of fossil fuel inputs into animal agriculture is going to be the key, I think, because these systems have no future if we're going to move to a post-carbon economy.
I mean, but how this is steered, I think, is a very big open question, isn't it? Because there are plenty of people arguing the fact that, you know, more environmentally sustainable, greener, and more animal-friendly farming is, you know, lockstep with more environmental farming. But you also see people arguing that actually, if we want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we need to get ruminants indoors, fed on things which produce less methane and so forth. I mean, do you worry that actually the climate agenda is going to be used by people to maintain an animal production system which keeps us isolated from having to confront this paradox?
Yeah, I mean, we're already seeing this in relation to poultry in particular in the UK, which is framed as a sort of climate-friendly meat, because when you look at grams of protein per emissions, it's meant to be better than beef and so on. So there's there's a sort of narrow climate lens which can be adopted, which is hugely damaging and sits in opposition to a much broader agroecological approach, which looks at climate, nature, and animal welfare in the whole, and so on. But ultimately, it comes down to a question of curtailing the use of fossil fuels and fossil fuel-based inputs. These arguments which are being made for the sustainability of intensification in relation to animal farming are not going to they're not going to last in the long run. And there's technological disruptions which are emerging as well in terms of lab-grown meat and cellular agriculture, which might further tip the system into an altered state. So I think that it's everything still to play for, and time is tight, but we can bring about this wholesale transition that we need to this decade.
Just to sort of like perhaps get, as we're getting towards the end, a lot of people who can share your concerns, a lot of people who reviewed your book favorably and everything, they advocate for something which is sometimes called ethical omnivory. And it's this idea which in a sense sounds quite reassuring that actually, you know, if we source our animal products well from good farms and everything, we can, you know, we can eat the full range of foods which we have evolved to eat and enjoy them and have a clear conscience. Now, clearly there's a sense in which what you're advocating is precisely that, but I can also get a sense that there's a certain kind of hint of skepticism about this idea of ethical omnivory, if you like. Am I right to pick up on that? What is it, and if so, what is it about that idea which you are a little bit wary of, perhaps?
Well, I think most people would claim to be ethical omnivores, but are typically pretty detached from the realities of food production, in particular the slaughter of animals, and reliant on all sorts of evasive strategies. This is what the book explores, and lots of this is in spite of our best intentions. This is a book that's really positive about human nature and human intentions. We are deeply empathetic and we do want the best, but we are caught up in this system of denial and distraction, which keeps us from engaging with the moral consequences of our diet. So I think that ethical omnivory can, or usually is, a sort of blanket that we wrap around ourselves. But I also challenge the idea in the book that what we typically think of as higher welfare, free range, better animal farming, that's really the end of the story. I think there are significant questions that can still be posed about those systems. And I think we should look at those systems, these sort of higher welfare organic systems, as the foundation we build from, not the ceiling that we aspire to. You know, this is the very least that we should be doing. And then beyond that, there are all sorts of difficult questions to unpick about how animals should live, what sort of lives we should give them, how many do we really need to be farming, and how many do we really need to be consuming, which are much bigger questions. It's slightly pie in the sky at the moment because we've got big things to deal with. But I think it's important that we look beyond what we typically think of as higher welfare, and ask ourselves some serious challenges, serious questions, and challenge ourselves to think about the full ethical consequence of our diets, and challenge ourselves to take seriously the vegan proposal that maybe we don't need animals in our food system. That doesn't mean you have to succumb to that conclusion immediately, but let's take it seriously, and let's think about what niche, if any, animals should play in a future farming system.
And finally, it seems to me there's a sense in which you kind of want to leave your readers both a bit uncomfortable, but also somewhat uncertain. And I mean, one thing I noticed was I don't think, tell me if I missed it, but I don't think in the book you ever actually explicitly say what your own sort of dietary decisions are, what exactly you eat and don't. Is that because you too are in a position where you're really not sure yourself what ideally you should be eating and how?
So I position myself squarely as a non-vegan because that's what I am. But I eat plants on a day-to-day basis. But I am, sitting in this space where I see animals as having a role, certainly in the near future in our farming system, and it being really important that we support those organic farmers and agroecological farmers who are trying to resolve the climate and nature crisis. So I think I also wanted to resist the temptation to present there being a single straightforward solution to this. I think there are a sort of sustainable diets can sit within a spectrum. There's no one single dietary pattern which is sustainable. And there's a real ethical conundrum which is presented in the book, which we each have to work through in our own way. And what the book tries to do is help the reader find their space in this debate in a slightly different way, understand that there are these cognitive and cultural pressures which are shaping their thought and behavior in unexpected ways, and hopefully present a tale in which the sort of slightly conflicted emotions of meat make sense and feel like an important part of who we are, so that we can begin to respond to all this in a more coherent manner.
Well, I mean, I think one of the great strengths of the book is that it doesn't shy away from the complexities. It doesn't give us neat answers, but it certainly gives a lot to think about. And it's been great speaking to you, Rob. I'm afraid that's all we got time for. So thank you, Rob, and thank you for everyone who tuned in to watch. If you would like to dig even deeper into the many contradictions and problems of the meat paradox, Rob's book is out now, and you can find a link and details of a 20% discount in the live chat now. You can also visit the RSA's website to find out more about the Regenerative Futures program of work and how to get involved in the work of the growing global fellowship. So for now, thanks again for joining us. Thanks once more to Rob, and we'll see you all next time.